Today, we're going to be talking about efficient and affordable remote monitoring for land trusts. I am Jake. I'm here from Upstream Tech. We also have Jeremy from Gallatin Valley Land Trust and Kelder from Mainspring Conservation Trust who'll be joining. We'll give folks just a moment to get settled in. But in the meantime, Kate is joining us as well from my team. She's going to be helping us with some things in the background here. Kate, if you'd like to go ahead and get our poll questions set up, we can give folks something to do while we're getting started. But we're really curious what kind of monitoring folks are getting up to. So let us know, what are you most interested in looking into? Are you talking about monitoring conservation easements, land protection work, managing properties, restoration, watersheds, something else? We haven't caught you there. Again, drop anything in the Q&A that you're curious to make sure we get into here. So we'll leave that open for a moment while I hop into our agenda. So we'll get started in just a moment with some introductions, so you know who we are and sort of what experience the folks we've got today bring to the conversation around remote monitoring. And then we'll do a bit of an overview just to orient folks as to how land trusts use remote monitoring, what it's all about, before we jump into some different examples. We'll save time at the end for questions and answers. So again, as you're joining, feel free to use that Q&A box to let us know what you're going to be most interested in learning today. All right, so why don't we go ahead and release the results of that poll, see what folks are curious about here. So definitely heavy on the conservation easements, which is great. A couple land protection folks are here as well, folks thinking about property management and restoration. So that's helpful. We'll definitely make sure that we're focusing on all those things as we get going. Okay, so let's hop into some quick introductions. So again, my name's Jake Faber. I've been here at Upstream working with our land trust partners on Lens for about the last 4 years or so. Two of the folks that we've been working with for a while here joining us, we've got Jeremy and Kelder as well, so I'll give them a quick chance to say hello before we jump into some overview here. But Jeremy, why don't you go ahead?
Good deal. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jeremy Puckett. I'm the Stewardship Director with Gallatin Valley Land Trust. I've been on board with GVLT for about 4.5 years. Prior to that was in Western Colorado with Colorado West Land Trust and Black Canyon Regional Land Trust. And like a lot of other people, initially got into remote monitoring around the time that COVID was peaking, and there was no opportunity for people to travel around and meet face to face. So that's how we got involved.
And I'm Kelder Monar with Mainspring Conservation Trust in Western North Carolina. And my title, Stewardship Manager and GIS Specialist. And I've been with Mainspring for something like 12 years. Pretty much that whole time been involved in easement monitoring and seen the program develop and expand over time, improve. And this is definitely one of the tools we've used to improve our program. And I'll talk later about this, but we do have some pretty challenging terrain in Western North Carolina. It's a mountainous area. But what got us really interested in, so that was maybe why we were interested in remote monitoring to begin with. But what made us take the plunge in was a grant program that the Land Trust Alliance had available that covered the first year of cost for Lens for us. And then we got enough utility out of it that first year that we stuck with it and have for probably 4 or 5 years.
Excellent. Thanks, Kelder. I will take a quick moment to acknowledge Kelder and Jeremy both have done a lot of, I guess, work with other land trusts around how to share the things that they've learned from those initial programs, both through the Land Trust Alliance grant program that Kelder mentioned, and Jeremy also was involved in one through Puckett, Colorado, again, back in kind of the early COVID times when a lot of land trusts were getting started with this. So a lot of great experience there that they've developed over the years. To give you a little context for what they're going to be talking about in just a moment, I figured I'd start with just some of the basics, just so everybody feels comfortable with some of the different concepts we'll be covering. In general, I like to start talking about remote monitoring just with an acknowledgement that, for the most part, folks understand, I think, that seeing the landscapes that you protect from above can be a really helpful perspective. You know, I think it's fair to say probably everybody on the line has used Google Earth before, has taken a look at the place they lived or something like that. And it can be really helpful for us to compare some of the changes over time that we see from sources like satellite and aerial data. So that's mostly what we're talking about when we refer to remote monitoring, is using that view from above, using that kind of data to get eyes on these properties. Now, why land trusts get into remote monitoring, though, runs the gamut, right? There are a couple of common motivations for why folks do this. And ultimately, that is going to drive some of the decision around, when and how you get into some of this. So a couple of the common ones that we hear, first off, with that view from above, it makes it a lot easier to see current property conditions very thoroughly across the whole site. I think pretty much anybody who's gone out and walked on a property for a field visit knows that it's tough to see everything, especially for larger sites. So it just helps to fill in the gaps sometimes of what you might not otherwise be able to see. We also can do something really unique with some of the data that's available, especially from satellite data sources, where that we can go back in time. So let's say we go out for a field visit this year and notice something's changed, rather than having to rely just on the things we've observed in the past to piece together what may have happened to lead up to that change. Makes it really helpful to be able to go and actually see, at different points in time over the last couple of years, what may have been going on. Besides that, I think a lot of land trusts recognize that monitoring is especially important for some of the management of risk around what happens on the properties we conserve. So getting updates more than once a year can be really helpful when it comes to potential violations and other issues on properties, where we just really want to know as soon as possible when there's something we may need to go and follow up on. Besides that, there's a lot of, Kelder's going to talk about this in particular for Western North Carolina. There's a lot of, tough terrain out there that that land trusts take care of. And there's some areas that just don't make a lot of sense to, send one person out to go monitor on their own, whether for safety reasons or access trouble. So makes it really helpful to have another tool in your back pocket for that. And then the last one I want to call out here is that it really comes down to efficiency a lot of the time, right? Stewardship, I think, is one of these things that is really hard to get new resources for. So as a community, I think it's really helpful for us to think about how we can do that work more efficiently, so we can prioritize those limited resources, whether that's staff time or dollars we're spending, doing the most high priority work, connecting with landowners, and managing some of the properties that they all take care of. So Jeremy and Kelder both do their remote monitoring work through Lens, which is a tool that Upstream has. We work with around 200 or so land trusts, as well as other state agencies, NGOs, different types of conservation organizations, with the intention of making remote monitoring really simple and easy for folks to get started with. So just to give you a sense of familiarity about what you'll see in some of their examples, the idea behind Lens is that we can tap into data sources from a bunch of different places, and then you can find high resolution imagery at these much more affordable rates, with all of the built-in tools to support monitoring, reporting, and analysis. With that, it's meant to be a really simple way for an entire team to get in and sort of share insights. So, sort of a web-based collaborative tool. So that's kind of what you're going to be seeing through some of these examples. I'm happy to take some more questions about how it works later on. In general, the goal with Lens is to make remote sensing as accessible and efficient as possible. Again, easy to use tool here that's specifically focused on conservation and resource management. So that's what you'll be seeing. Now, as far as which tools you get into, again, there's a lot, and we try to make as much available in Lens as we can, but ultimately, I think it's helpful to ground the conversation in what kinds of questions you're trying to answer. So are you trying to go the efficiency route and just make sure that you're meeting all of your obligations to monitor all of your conserved land as painlessly as possible? Are you trying to understand larger scale issues, maybe land use change in your service area? Are there specific disturbances and maybe unexpected events that you just really want to make sure you're keeping on top of? Or perhaps it's more related to new activities on an easement that you just want to make sure you're keeping tabs on. So depending on these kinds of questions, that's going to guide which of those different tools we might use to do that remote monitoring work. So some of the considerations here are going to be around things like the resolution of an image. So these numbers up here, the 0.3 meter, 0.5 meter, even 10 meter, that refers to how basically detailed the image is, how much clarity we're going to have when we zoom in at these smaller scales around things like identifying this fence line or these small structures. So that's one consideration you may think about. You might also consider the timing of imagery, the frequency it comes in. So something like this Sentinel data from ESA's European Space Agency, that comes in every 5 days, whereas maybe this USDA imagery comes every couple of years for most of us in the US. So a couple of different considerations. And again, as we get a little bit more in the weeds, feel free to ask questions if you're curious about what might work best for some of the situations you're dealing with. And as always, just like to drop a few reminders before we get excited about all of the things we're gonna dig into. First off, as with anything, make sure that you're following any guidance or requirements that apply to your programs, especially for land trusts that I'm sure most of you guys are here representing. Standards and practices always are going to be your sort of guiding standard for what to make sure you're keeping in mind when you do any sort of stewardship work. Also, this is a great opportunity to do this one, but learn from other organizations that have firsthand experience. Like I said, we work with over 200 organizations that use this at a land trust, and so there's a lot of knowledge in the community that folks are very willing to share. So again, Jeremy and Kelder are going to be able to help you get started with that one. The other thing that I think is also important is that remote monitoring is meant to complement some of the other tools that you're working with, right? So obviously you're still going to go out in person, still going to go put boots on the ground, still going to go meet with landowners if you use these tools, but it helps to make sure that you're thinking about where you can spend these different resources to get the most impact. Then finally, for your own organization, things might be a little different. Make sure you're setting internal practices that anybody on your team can follow. So just a good thing to keep in mind is make sure that you're explaining your methods, explaining how you do your monitoring and how you make your observations so that if somebody else comes along later on, they can pick up where you left off. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of, some of the key considerations when you're getting started with remote monitoring. Let's get a little more practical now, and I'll hand over to Kelder to start us off talking about how Mainspring got started with remote monitoring and some of the examples of what that looks like for them. So Kelder, I will hand the screen share off. Yeah.
Sure. Well, like I said, I'm with Mainspring Conservation Trust in Western North Carolina, and we, as I said, got started with that LTA grant program, but had been talking about it for a couple of years. The basic situation that we're in, as Jake alluded to, is that we're in really tough terrain. We've got easements everywhere from 2 acres to 1,200 acres. We, as I'm sure most of you do, monitor them every year. And in order to see the back corners of some of these easements, it's like a full 8 hours of hiking. And even then, like, you can't see everything. And so to meet our responsibility was always just a real physical challenge for our staff. Share my screen and give you an example. So this here is one of our conservation easements, and it's 930 acres. And I guess I'm using lens right now, so hopefully all can see that. So all my examples are going to be using lens, and y'all can get a sense for what the program looks like. But this easement is mostly surrounded by Forest Service, but down here at the bottom, there's a reservoir, there are neighbors in close proximity. And so we do always visit this part of the property every year. But then there's a 2,000-foot elevation gain from that bottom part of the property with the reservoir up to the ridge line. And it really does take hours and hours to hike up there. This is a watershed property, a municipal watershed, and there's no regularly maintained trails in there, so it really is bushwhacking. But at the same time, these upper boundaries are all with United States Forest Service land. So just getting eyes on it takes a lot of effort, but there's never any payoff in terms of like discovering violations or just anything at all, really. It's always very quiet up there. And so Lens is such a good tool to maximize the value we get out of our efforts, that we can still send staff down to look at that lower reservoir area, but not have to spend hours and hours and hours and, you know, possibly endangering staff safety on bushwhacking to like always go up to those upper areas. So that's been really cool. Now you'll notice that this image is only partially of the property and half of it's missing. And that kind of goes along with the territory too. In our experience, areas with more people, more houses more developed, tend to get more imagery available, whether that's realtors or businesses. I'm not sure what drives that, but I have noticed that really remote parts of our easements are sometimes left out. But this is from April of this past year, and I can look back to November of last year. And yes, it's a little cloudy, but there's still an image that, while maybe not so useful for that little reservoir area at the bottom, it does allow us to see up in those upper elevations, and would let us know if there was some kind of logging or other major change. So that's pretty cool. Just a general use case for why we like Lens. I will note that we still visit all of our properties, at least in some fashion, on the ground, but for looking at those back corners and maximizing return for effort, it's a great tool. So that's a conservation easement example. This is one of our fee simple properties, and I just bring it up because we're in Western North Carolina, and we're in an area impacted by Hurricane Helene. And so we've gotten questions over the past year since the hurricane about how our properties were affected. And fortunately, in our part of North Carolina, we were spared the worst effects. Didn't have the horrendous flooding, but did have some. And so this property here is one where we probably had the most impacts. And it's not so much to the property itself, but to the access road. So I'm going to zoom in to this area here, and there's a creek that runs along the boundary, roughly along the boundary. That's where I'm tracing my cursor. But after the storm, the creek overflowed its banks and went into the access road. And so this is the access road that is now a branch of the creek. And then there's a tributary stream that came in over here that also got captured by the creek. So it's just a really complicated mess, and we can't get a vehicle into this property anymore, which is a shame because there's a large early successional habitat area that we've maintained in the past and haven't been able to figure out how to do. But anyway, so Lens, helped us visualize that. I wish I could show you the change from the previous image. That's one of the cool things about Lens. You can easily compare from one image to another. But we kind of got lucky with the image I started off showing you, that there's snow on the ground that made everything really visible. In this one, that was, well, I guess that's not even before the storm, but it's an earlier one. You can't actually see the change, and in this one you can't really see through the trees. So conditions on the ground make a big difference in what you're able to see. Another property that was potentially in the storm's path was this one. This one's a much smaller one, like 13 acres. And Jake, you might know more about this, but I didn't have to order this image here. This is a really high resolution image that was taken just after Hurricane Helene, like a week after. And it just showed up in my available imagery here related to the hurricane response. And like it shows the property quite clearly. This property didn't have any effects from the hurricane. You can see there's some sediment deposited on the banks of the property on the other side of this creek. But this was a useful image to me because this easement comes with a pretty strong riparian buffer requirement. There's supposed to be 50 feet of unmowed area from the top of the bank going into the property. And this did show me that this strip along the bank here had been recently mowed when the owner of this property had told me that that she was going to talk to the mower and get the mower to stop. And obviously that hasn't happened. So I find lens really useful in just, I have a couple properties on my mind at any time that I'm curious about. And one of the really helpful features they do is send an email out when there's new imagery available. And so I find myself checking that and looking at properties I'm curious about, and helps me keep tabs on management activities that the landowners are doing, especially in response to a violation. My next example is of a violation. This is not a conservation easement. This is a kind of weird deed restricted property that was donated to us, and then we sold, and it wasn't worth a conservation easement, but there are some deed restrictions, mainly related to the location of where a house could be built. And a couple of years ago, after we'd started using Lens, a house was built on the property. And the restriction is that the house had to be built south of this line that kind of divides this part of the property in two. So this is fair game for a house. This is supposed to be the forested area, no house. And the first image we looked at before getting ready to monitor this property showed a house that was built right here. So it's like half of it's where a house is allowed and half of it is where a house is not allowed. And so we look at that and boom, panic. Oh no, we've got this house built. Like it's already done. Like this is a weird deed restricted property, not a conservation easement. Like, how do we respond to this? And so we were kind of panicked for a little bit, but like made a game plan to approach the landowner with this in mind and have that conversation. But we also looked at some other imagery, and that made it a little bit better, maybe a little bit less likely to blow up. So on the right side, I've got an April image from 2022, but then the October image on the left side from 2021 shows the same house, but the house is apparently in a totally different position, like almost entirely off of the forested area. And so like, looking at this image, I'm thinking, oh, well, maybe there's not a problem after all. And that kind of goes to illustrate that, like, I mean, this imagery is really helpful, but they comes from different sources. And as like part of the data processing, there's some choices made in georeferencing, and like slightly different methods of doing that gives you slightly different results. And when you're looking at something like this small at this scale, it always is important to check things in person. So that was kind of an interesting example of how this is used, and like the drawbacks and benefits of it. On the other hand, like this is an example of a property, a much larger property, a dairy, and there are some structures built right here. And I bring this image up because it's not so much about the question about where the buildings were built, but just to give it as an example, I had a board member who drives by this property pretty frequently and was concerned about the big construction project that was going on, he saw. And he knew that there was a limit on impervious surfaces for this property. And he was just like really, really anxious about it. And it just so happened that 3 days before this image had been released. And so I was able to download it and quickly, without even going to the property, get a measurement for what the acreage is using this like analysis feature here. And like just like that, it'll, well, that's I'm like messing it up in a panic, but yeah, it'll tell you like what an acreage is of an area. And so I was able to assure him that these structures were below the allowed limit. So that's just, you know, being able to interact with a board member like that and just show that you're on top of the situation did a lot for my credibility in my position. So I have a last example. These have mostly been from conservation easements so far, and that's mostly how we use it, just checking up on things. But this is an example of an image from one of our fee simple properties, and we actually used it as part of our management. This is a detailed enough image, a fine enough resolution that in this area here, it's about 10 acres, a former cornfield that has grown up with trees and natural vegetation. Our management goal is to keep as much of it open as possible as pollinator habitat. And in planning some work on the property, I pulled this image up and was able to see individual trees, and even in some cases, tell species. Like this lighter color here is tulip poplar, and that's a really weedy tree species. And then some of these darker ones are red cedar, which we keep around because it's got berries that are good for birds. And so I was able to just plan our visit to this area of the property and be more effective in planning what trees we were going to take and what we were going to leave to further our goals. So that's my last example, but it's just been great having Lens as one of our tools.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelder. Definitely helpful to see, I think, some of the particular before and afters for actual changes that you've seen. I know often we hope that we don't see too much when we go and do our monitoring, and when something actually, comes up, like that example of the structures that you showed, I think it's definitely reassuring to be able to see that you can, just get in there and do what you need to do. All right. So Jeremy, why don't we hand off to you? I know you've been using Lens for a little while now, have a totally different kind of geography you're working in. So really curious to see, some of the things you've been up to as you're doing your remote monitoring.
Absolutely. Let's see. I'm going to try changing the share here to my screen. See if that works. All right. You guys got a visual there?
Looking good on my end.
Okay. All right. So back into Lens. Just give a quick overview of our program. We have at GVLT, we have 135 conservation easements covering roughly 75,000 acres in southwest Montana over a 3-county service area from Madison through Gallatin and into Park counties, kind of just to the northwest of Yellowstone National Park. We definitely have challenges with elevation and terrain here, especially seasonal access issues from snowpack and really wet conditions in the spring when things are melting out. Other challenges that we have throughout the year are potential wildfire risk, predators. We have grizzly bears and a lot of black bears and mountain lions that inhabit some of our properties, tricky 4-wheel drive roads, busy farmers, and lots of out-of-state owners that can be challenging to reach and coordinate site visits with. So Lens is a really good tool to add flexibility to our program and give us a way to feel confident that we can meet our monitoring objectives over the course of a year, even if we're experiencing some of these other challenges that get in the way of getting out on the ground. We do try to communicate with all of our landowners every year. We have a policy that allows us to use remote monitoring 2 out of every 3 years. So, we would have to be on the ground at least once out of every 3 years, but we can use remote monitoring up to twice in a row if we need to for the reasons previously shared. I guess the other thing to be realizing here is that our portfolio is a mix of both kind of suburban areas in proximity to Bozeman, Montana, and other smaller communities throughout the service area, as well as some very rural areas and actually very remote areas within kind of in-holding areas within the Forest Service that surrounds this region. So Lens is a great tool for us to, again, kind of increase our flexibility in monitoring. We use it for supplemental purposes if we can't get out on a property and cover the entire property on foot. We use it for tracking of exercise of reserved rights and also for just general kind of change detection, monitoring of large restoration projects and things of that nature. So with that, I'm going to go into a couple of examples here quickly. This is a property that's just east of Bozeman, has a nice riparian corridor that's matured over time. However, the stream channel was fairly straight as a result of channelization so that the adjacent kind of sub-irrigated uplands could be used for agricultural purposes. So this property owner went through the notice and approval process to develop a stream restoration project. And one of the things that we're able to use Lens for is to kind of look at the change in the stream character, looking at the original plans and making sure that that result is accurate to the plans and that we experienced what we wanted to on the other end. You can see kind of the staging of some of the spoils from creating a large pond north of the creek and the eventual kind of recontouring and final grading of that berm area up here and revegetation of that area. So this is one way that we use Lens to look at kind of restoration projects, habitat management, things of that nature on a property. We tend to go for the higher resolution imagery, either 0.3 or 0.5 meter, because it allows you to see structures fairly easily, as well as other like management tracks across the property that may or may not be allowed. And then you can go back and you can look to see, well, is that a permanent track the next year? Maybe not. Maybe it was just something they were using that particular year and it didn't actually end up being a permanent track or a permanent concern on that property. So that's one example. This is another kind of different example on a large farm that has a pretty substantial building envelope and established dairy infrastructure on it. And this may seem like a trivial type of thing, but the building envelope on this particular property runs kind of right along the edge of a production agricultural field. And we realized in monitoring that, lo and behold, a new 1,500 square foot basketball court had been built slightly outside of the building envelope. And you can actually see that the tractors and the combines are having to go around that new feature to some degree. And of course, the landowner wasn't too happy that we were being that detailed in our monitoring. But, this is a good tool for us to be able to say, this is what the agricultural use looked like prior to this new improvement. And now we can see the effect of that basketball court actually changing to a minor degree the farming activity there. And this will be a really interesting property in the future too, because the the landowner has engaged in a contract with the Natural Resources Conservation Service to remove most of the old dairy-related structures on the property. And so over time, we'll be able to see the removal of those structures and kind of the rehabilitation of this area. And that will be interesting to us from a monitoring standpoint. Another example of how we've used this tool is had a property owner call us and say, hey, my neighbor just put in a new fence without communicating with us at all. We had no idea this was going to happen. This is an out-of-state landowner. And we were able to look at imagery from before the incident. And then right around the time that the incident occurred, you can see right here along the northern property boundary of this property, there's a new disturbance along here that relates to the reconstruction of that particular fence line. And you can see in some areas there was actually encroachment into the conservation easement as a result of that clearing activity. When we went out to the property, we weren't quite sure what to expect as far as remedies for this encroachment. But what we found upon arriving on the property is that this area is actually way too wet to get heavy equipment into. And there had been some rutting and some other things. And we ultimately decided in this case, even though there was encroachment, that this vegetation would eventually grow back. We encouraged the landowner to burn any piles associated with timber that had been removed, but we didn't want to get in there with additional heavy equipment and muck up that part of the property even more. So we have a situation now where we're monitoring the revegetation of that fence line and making sure that no additional encroachment occurs, and hoping to work with that landowner over the next 5 years or so to bring that property condition back into better alignment with the conservation values there. Other things that we were able to see on this property that were interesting to us, we can look back at a point at which this home was being remodeled and some of the landscaping was being redone around it. We can look at the extent of vegetation around the area to see what they've been doing. And here we were able to determine that they've actually increased their open space around this pond to some degree. This was not discussed with the land trust before this was done. And so we were able to discuss this with the landowner and remind them that they have a responsibility to communicate with us anytime that they're doing significant vegetation management on the property. Other things that show up, there's some structures out here that were ultimately removed from the property. We're able to see that kind of scale pretty easily with lens. So even smaller structures we can keep track of in terms of their appearance or disappearance over time. Let's see. Oops, gotta let that disappear here. Gotta sneak back up. Okay, this is a really large property just outside of West Yellowstone. The property owner here had the right to build on multiple different building envelopes within the property and came to GVLT with a proposal to do so on at least one of the building envelopes. And so this is on the left, this is a condition prior to any construction activity beginning to occur. You can see there's just open space within this network of lots that had been conserved as a large conservation easement. So the owner decided that they would develop one single lot on the property. And as we zoom in, you can tell there's some pretty significant construction ongoing here. If we look at another more recent NAPE image for comparison, we can see hopefully this won't take too long to load. There we go. You can kind of see the progression of the construction activity and get a sense for what's going on. Initially you might have been concerned, like, what is this? Are they putting in a roundabout driveway, or is there something going on there that's different than the plan? But ultimately you can see over time that they recontoured that area, did not turn it into some kind of a circular drive. They've put in outdoor patios and various landscaping features and whatnot. One of the things that was interesting on this property, though, is that the construction process involved creation of this undesirable and actually disallowed haul road that was being used to take all of the excavated fill from this particular construction project down and create a huge berm between the subdivision and the interior of this property. Part of the conservation values of this property are the open space scenic views. And so ultimately we were able to remind the landowner of that and say, hey, we need to remove that berm, recontour, revegetate, take out the haul road. And again, we can kind of use lens to look at this over time to see how they're doing in terms of the reclamation and revegetation efforts that they have agreed to. Other things that you could potentially see here on this property, there was a right to create a small road through a corner of the property here to access another potential building lot. This is actually Forest Service land immediately adjacent to the property. And so when the opportunity for this owner came to get the permit to do this, they didn't have time to reach out to the trust and say, hey, we're going to create this road. And so we can see the evidence of this new road being constructed. And ultimately, they did have the right to construct that road. They just didn't do it in as timely a manner as we would have liked and provided us advance notice. So you're able to see things like that fairly easily in Lens when you're using this high resolution imagery. Let's see, a similar type of example here would be this small building envelope right here. We've got some activity that involves enlargement of a parking area around these structures. We've got new roofs being put on structures. You can see that there's also some new trails and new activity occurring on the property, especially up here in this upper area. This is a successor landowner who understood that they could pursue agricultural activities on the property, and they felt the need to create some additional new access for UTVs and things of that nature. And when we found this out, we again did not have notice, and so captured this imagery so that we could get a sense of what we would be in for when we arrived on scene to talk with the property owner about these new UTV trails and things across this property. And so you can see definitely some trail use, and their main goal here is to be able to manage livestock on the property and to be able to travel fence lines that get broken, trampled down by large elk herds that move through the area. So they have a valid argument for wanting to have that type of access, but we were able to meet with them on site, have a sense for what they were trying to do, and then kind of roll this back to a process of saying, let's work together to get it right and not just have trails all over. And so we'll be monitoring this property moving forward for compliance with any additional terms for revegetation or erosion mitigation and things of that nature. I think I'll leave it at that. It seems like I'm probably running right up to the end of our time, so I'm going to leave it at that, and I will stop sharing and hand it back to Jake.
Oh. Jeremy, actually, if you want to pull that back up for a moment, I was going to get us started with our Q&A here.
Yeah.
you mentioned a couple times some of the choices that you made with the monitoring for those properties around imagery resolution and how you selected certain images. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about, for folks that are, maybe newer to this, just trying to get a feel for what that resolution allows you to do in certain situations. How do you go about deciding what's appropriate for the kinds of issues you're looking at, and how do you actually access those images?
Yeah. Okay. So as a general rule, when I first got into doing remote monitoring, we were working with things on the scale of like 3-meter resolution up to 10-meter resolution, looking at more of a kind of a landscape scale image. Is there general disturbance that you can see? Can you make out the outline of a structure? So during that process, pretty easily learned that imagery at that scale is not really conducive to monitoring for construction or building envelope compliance, things of that nature. It's better for just general like vegetation changes or large landscape changes. So when we started working with Lens here at GVLT, I pretty much told the team, we're not going to buy anything less than half-meter resolution because it doesn't give us enough to see the finer details of like a new 2-track across the landscape, or a small 10 by 12 shed that's been placed outside of a building envelope in an area that's not allowed to have any non-residential structures even. So we are typically orienting our purchase of imagery towards those 0.3, 0.5 meter images. And, we follow the updates from Lens as imagery comes in, and generally just check to see like, what's the cloud cover like? What are the shadows like? Is it leaf on, leaf off, snow versus clear ground? And so our monitoring season is generally from like April through October. So we're hoping to find imagery that's within that same time frame. And just generally, the areas that are closer to town, under more real estate pressure and things like that, are going to have a lot more images to choose from. And so you just kind of have to check back periodically and figure out which one works best for your purpose. Some of the other properties that are further afield, you may only see 1 or 2 images pop up over the course of 6 months, and it may or may not be adequate for your purpose if it's not high enough resolution, or again, cloud cover or partial coverage of a larger property. So there are a lot of factors that we just kind of take into account as we think about what it is that we actually want to purchase. And then, once we've decided on an image, it's very easy just to check box and say we want to buy that image. And the invoicing and all of that is very easy. So we budget, a certain amount of money every year to make sure that we have enough financial resources to get the imagery that we need. And so far, we haven't even hit that budget. We're able to stay generally under that and get all the imagery that we feel like we need in an annual cycle.
Yeah, Kelder, I wanted to go back to something that you mentioned as well around some of the public data you found, especially after the hurricane. I could talk a little bit more about where some of those different data sources come from, but maybe before I get too ahead of myself, I'll just pause for a moment just to say, for folks that have any other questions, I know we've got a handful in the Q&A that I'm going to start to get us through in the time we have left. But feel free to keep them coming. If there's something that you want to take a little bit of a closer look at, you're welcome to. Kate's also sharing a couple of helpful resources in the chat that I just want to call out. So one of those is the Land Trust Alliance Remote Monitoring Toolkit. So this actually came out of some of those grant programs that both Jeremy and Kelder were part of, where a lot of land trusts sort of gave a lot of really helpful feedback to the Alliance around how they were using some of these different tools. So there's a lot of good intel there about just, what questions to be asking as you're getting started with all of this. And then also, I saw we did have a question about some of the whether there's anything accredited land trusts or terra firma members might have to keep particularly top of mind. There's some good information in the practical pointer that was linked in the chat as well. Kelder, I know you guys are an accredited land trust, so I'll also maybe point that the question to you. Is there anything that you guys try to make sure you're following just to be certain that you're keeping up with standards and practices?
Nothing like real top of mind. Like I said, we visited all our properties in person as well as using the remote imagery. So I think that takes care of a lot of LTA concerns. I think we are really deliberate about keeping records, and if there's anything that we're getting exclusively from aerial imagery, that we save that, not just in Lens, but like we do with any of our monitoring reports, like in digital and paper copies in different places. So I think just record keeping.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I was going to pull up. Oh, Jeremy, go ahead. While you're doing that, I'm just going to grab
Yeah,
a
I was
picture.
just going to say that I think the LTA requirement is that you are on the ground at least once every 5 years. So if you don't actually go out to visit with the landowner on the property, just make sure that your policies are consistent, your monitoring policies are consistent with the amount of frequency that you are returning to the property, so that you don't end up out of compliance with your own policies or with LTA standards and practices.
Yeah, thanks for I think that's like the one hard and fast rule with standards and practices. When you're adding remote monitoring to the mix, it's a little different from your typical stewardship. So again, at least once every 5 years. And Jeremy, I know earlier you mentioned you guys stick to a tighter schedule on that, which I think is pretty common for a lot of land trusts. But there's some flexibility there depending on, what kind of stewardship questions you're asking. So just again, be sure that the approach that you use, going back to what I was saying before, are tuned to the types of questions and motivations that you specifically have. Looks like we've got a couple questions coming in. At a quick glance, it looks like some around the imagery budgeting, and Jennifer, I see you had one as well about some of the just generally the mechanics of how some of this works. So why don't I pulled up an example here that I often like to share of a 500-acre reserve in eastern Massachusetts. So I think this might be helpful to add some context to like how you actually get the imagery from some of these different sources that Jeremy and Kelder were showing. So first, I'm going to just come back to that comparison image that I was showing earlier. So again, there's a lot under the umbrella of satellite and aerial data that we use in Lens. So our approach is that basically there's two general buckets that I would put satellite imagery into. There's the publicly available stuff and the commercially available. Public data usually is more widely available with some exceptions. So for instance, USDA has their National Agricultural Imagery Program, which covers most areas in the US every 2 or 3 years. And then I mentioned also the Sentinel-2 data is one from the European Space Agency, comes in every 5 days. Those are both, like when you get into Lens and you add a new property, those are readily available for free, right? When Kelder was showing some of the additional public imagery that came in after the hurricane, that was another one that came from NOAA that was, plane flown imagery immediately after the disaster. So sometimes for different areas, we might get additional public imagery that we can use. So all of those are often helpful as a sort of baseline comparison. And I'll show you over here in this Massachusetts example. In 2013, we had some imagery from the state, for instance, that was public and it was right there in Lens for us to use. So I can compare that against one of these commercial images. In this case, I'm looking at an image from this past April, and this one was from Airbus. So Airbus is one of the commercial vendors we work with that sell imagery, right? So you've got Maxar, Airbus, Nearmap, Planet, or some of the partners we work with on that. So typically, those vendors are producing imagery where there's demand for it, where they think they can sell it, rather than saying, I'm going to capture everything in the world every 5 days. So what we can do in Lens is one of two things. Either we can request custom imagery for those places, which comes at a higher price point, or because these vendors are capturing imagery pretty often for a lot of the areas that we're working, we can just come over here to see what they already have in their archives. So that's one of the nice things in Lens, that it kind of works like a buyer's club for imagery for conservation orgs, is how I often think of this aspect of it, where let's say I want this 50-centimeter resolution image from Maxar from this past summer. I can take a quick look at that image and make sure that it fits the bill for what I want to use in my monitoring. In this case, 6 cents an acre for 500 acres is going to be $30. So for the commercial imagery specifically, I can get as much or as little of that as I want, depending on the size of the areas and so forth. So this is obviously, kind of medium-sized property, 500 acres. So if I don't want imagery for the whole thing, I can also be a little more specific. So maybe I just want imagery of this portion of the property. I can come back to that same image. I think it was this one was the Maxar. And in that case, maybe I only want to order $6 and change worth of imagery. Yeah, so if folks have other questions about the mechanics of how accessing imagery works, at least in Lens, feel free to drop those in the chat. I'm curious, Jeremy and Kelder, if you might be able to each answer the question of how you think about budgeting for the imagery that you use each year.
Yeah, sure. We're not trying to do all of our properties annually with Lens. So we budget about $1,500 to $1,800 a year for imagery. And I would say we've probably on average been using remote monitoring for about 20 to 25 properties a year. And thus far, in terms of that budget amount, I think that we are $500 under budget pretty much every year for the past 4 years that we've been using this at GVLT. So, if you want to get everything for your whole portfolio, I think that you can just take your acreage and multiply it by 6 cents an acre and get an idea of what you need for a budgeted amount. Or you can kind of approach it like we do and say, we're going to use this more as a flexibility tool and try to be more selective about what we acquire, and keep it to a budgeted amount.
Yeah, and I didn't mention this earlier, but overall, we have about 16,000 acres under conservation easement. And so I guess we're not as big as some land trusts, and multiplying that by 6 or 8 cents an acre, it really only comes out to, $1,200, $1,500 for the actual imagery itself, and in the context of a monitoring program where we're spending much more than that on staff time and equipment. I mean, we spend more than that on gas mileage. So it's a pretty small component overall.
And we've got just a moment left here. We've definitely got more questions we're going to be able to answer in the next 2 minutes. So Kate, I think, is going to be able to share in the chat contact information so that you can get a hold of us for anything we don't get a chance to cover live. But the last thing that I'll just mention here as I'm looking through a couple of these, once you have access to the imagery, obviously there are different things you do with that, right? So the kind of monitoring that Jeremy and Kelder were showing, often this is a collaborative sort of space, right? So we have different folks on our team who can come in here and make observations. So if I want to go back and look at a note that Jessie made in 2020, I can pull up the same imagery that she was looking at and see what she was observing. From there, I can also do different kinds of analysis and automation and different, add different things to the mix. So I pulled up this property quickly just to show you a quick little sample of what's possible there. If I come over here into this lookout tool, that's where we're running some of the monitoring in the background, actually using some of those more frequent data sources that we get. So for instance, over here, just outside this property boundary, we can see where that lookout tool picked up a small change in vegetation, which if I then go and follow up by looking at a higher resolution image from before and a higher resolution image from after, you can see where there was a small lot that was cleared. So it's about 100 feet by 100 feet for reference. So, similar kind of issue, I think, to what you guys were looking at, just a bit of a different way of getting in there. You see, we also have other tools here around things like change in parcel ownership and, lots of other stuff we can layer onto here. So again, if you're curious about some of these other tools, certainly get in touch and any of us can help out to steer you in the right direction as far as how you can use some of these particular resources in your monitoring. Now we're at the top of the hour here. We will make sure that everybody gets the recording of this session. And again, in the chat, check out some of those other resources. Feel free to reach out with any other questions we weren't able to get to live. But thanks so much, everybody, for joining. And Jeremy and Kelder, really appreciate you guys being so willing to sort of share your experience with other folks and yeah, I know there's a lot of really good knowledge in the room here. So thank you again.
Absolutely. Happy to help.
Happy to
Excellent.
help.
All right. Well, thanks again for joining, folks, and hope to see you soon.